All right, so I am going to be talking today about a project that I did in this last year to move subjects from our MARC records to ArchivesSpace records. And I apologize, I haven't really had a chance to practice it because my father's funeral interrupted writing the presentation. So our problem was that historically we had split archival description between the cataloging department and the archives unit. This description had led to records for the same item which had different kinds of controlled subjects and sometimes even different controlled names in them. For the most part, the MARC records had better subject content. So we asked ourselves, how could we reuse that data without going through them one by one? The goals that I set out for myself were first to build a spreadsheet of the subjects that should be added to the ArchivesSpace records, then create those necessary subject records in ArchivesSpace, and then finally make that connection between subject records and ArchivesSpace resource records. I apologize, I'm trying to refer to it as resource records throughout. I used 4 main tools. I started off with the ArchivesSpace MySQL database to get out the initial first info about the resources. I used MARC Edit to manage the data I was getting from the catalog. I used OpenRefine, and I also used Excel at points during this. I don't really talk as much about those. And then I used Python, specifically the ArchiveSnake library, to talk with the ArchivesSpace API. So this project was really, as I described it, a series of tubes. It was creating a lot of pipes, figuring out how I needed to connect them up and how we could get this data out of the catalog and into ArchivesSpace. So I'm going to walk through the 5 steps: extracting the MARC and ArchivesSpace data, pairing the records and subjects with the resources, managing the resources and subjects, identifying the unique subjects to build those records, and then adding subjects to resources. First, extracting data. For the actual extract, I simply worked with one of our batch team members to extract everything that had a holding that was a manuscript. So I then used MARC Edit to create a CSV with the following fields: the cat key, the 245, the 650s as separated by pipe values. So if you'll see there between archives and dairy products on that second line, there's a pipe. Same thing between sources and dairy products on the 4th line. And then I got out the 856 subfield U, which is the URL to the finding aid. This was somewhat inconsistent, but it was one of the ways that I matched data between resources. In extracting the ArchivesSpace data, I went over to the MySQL database. I used MySQL Workbench to access it, and I said select the ID, the title, and the EAD ID from our resource table where the title was not unspecified. The repo ID was repo ID 3, which is our main repo, and they were published. So then I got a CSV out of that with the following fields: ID, title, and EAD ID. I should say in future slides I'm going to refer to the first ID as the ArchivesSpace ID or the ASpace ID. Now ideally I would pair records on the title. They pretty much all uniquely match. I think anyone who's ever looked at MARC records and ArchivesSpace records for the same collection knows that that almost never happens. We also had multiple records with the same or similar titles. So I started off by pairing on the EAD ID, which was the file name from the 856 subfield U. So you see the 217 there, .htm. That would be EAD ID 217. And then I'm working on creating a document that pairs on titles, easily working through unique titles for a batch, and then I will be reviewing non-unique titles for a second batch, or technically a 3rd batch. So I had derived the data from the 856 U's. I had uploaded a spreadsheet of all records with one to OpenRefine, and then a spreadsheet of all the ArchivesSpace records, which including their EAD ID, to OpenRefine. I used the cell cross function, which I'm going to try documenting or finding documentation for after the forum, because I talk about it a lot. I used it to look at 2 different OpenRefine projects, get data from one project matching on one field, and then bring another field. So essentially using it as a database key. You can use 2 OpenRefine projects as a database key, and that's the short version of cell cross. So I used that to create a new, to insert the MARC, this presentation, there we go. I had the bar over part of my slide, the ASpace ID into the column in the MARC spreadsheet. So what I ended up with then was an ASpace ID, a cat key, the 650s, and the A56U. So then I had to remove all the columns except for the ASpace ID and the 650s, which is what I would need. So I used OpenRefine to split the 650s on the pipe character, and then I filled down ArchivesSpace IDs, and I have another data sample coming up. So for the same thing here, you would see it had split on the pipe, so now there's 3 650s, and then I filled down the ASpace ID field so that there's one paired with each. So now I essentially have a pairing of the ASpace ID and the full textual string, although with subfields, which is important for later, of each subject. So it's a one-to-one. The subjects could repeat many, many times. The same resource might have multiple subjects. So in OpenRefine, I then sorted by 650, reordered permanently, which is very important. Otherwise, your data will behave as though it's not sorted, and blanked down the 650 section. And yeah, so here's an example. It's sorted on the 650s. So we have all the places where this 650 is used with 3 different ArchivesSpace IDs. Blank down, it does that. I then copied the 650s column only into text files. So this meant I had a text file that was all of the 650s only once. There were lots of extra lines, so I removed all the line breaks. I stripped the final punctuation and any spaces. You see, in this one I've taken that period out, but it was in the earlier forms. I then used one of the scripts, which I'll be linking to at the end of this, buildsubjects.py, which creates new JSON subject objects. It parses each subfield identifier to ensure that the terms are properly tagged as things like geographic, temporal, I believe is what the term is. The terms vary slightly between the MARC documentation and what ASpace calls it, so I've worked it all out and it's documented. And then I used upload subjects, which is a simple way of putting them against the post in the ArchivesSpace API. That also uses the ArchiveSnake logging method and such. ASpace will identify the duplicates and just reject them, but it gives you a useful answer that you can then parse for information, and it matches terms if they exist and adds if they don't. So I didn't have to keep adding subfield Z Pennsylvania over and over again. ArchivesSpace understood that the geographic subdivision of Pennsylvania should just match against the geographic subdivision of Pennsylvania. This is a quick look at the sample data as it would look in the text file. I then extracted the subject IDs and full subject strings from the log back into a spreadsheet. Now for duplicates, it uses a conflicting record field, which is the response you still get from the API that says, oh, you were looking for subject 1112. So I had the log essentially have the full text string and then the ID or the conflicting subject. I used those, I'm trying to remember now how I processed them. I didn't have that offhand, but I think I just threw them into a, so they could process them with as JSON. I then threw them into OpenRefine, ran the cell cross again on the full subject strings and said, okay, now pull the subject IDs into the spreadsheet. And then I deleted the subject string column. So now I have an ASpace ID and the subject ID. I'm going to go back a few slides to show what that had looked like. Now this is substituted in, and then you see the next subject ID is below that. And then filled down the IDs. So that would make the next one 239.38, 239.38, and then 239.39. I then reordered, sorted by ASpace ID, and reordered permanently. So now I finally have a list of sequential ArchivesSpace IDs and subject IDs. I used it to blank down the ArchivesSpace IDs and join them in multi-valued cells. So that would look like taking out the two 1406s over here and bringing up the 2939 and 2940. This is a sample of what that looks like. I again joined them on pipes, which is what my script expected. And then I used, and I'll talk about these in just a sec, the update resources script I had wrote to download and update resources, and then upload update resources to upload to the system. I broke it into 2 phases just to be on the safe side and ensure that I had time to review things. I could have made it a full round trip, but I wanted to look at some things manually before I posted them. So a quick look into update resources. Essentially, that script downloads the resource record, opens the resource record, and it says, okay, for each subject identifier, and I'll clarify that when I update this PDF. I mentioned I finished it today. For each subject identifier, it ensures that a relationship doesn't already exist in the subjects subsection. If no relationship, it appends that into subjects. If subjects doesn't exist, then it goes straight into just creating new subjects. So it includes such things as a test to see if subjects already exist. It grabs all the subjects that currently exist, preserves their current order, and then adds everything onto that. I will note that whatever order things are in this is the order that they'll be when they're added to the record. I know in cataloging, historically, order of subjects has kind of mattered, so that might be a thing to review. However, we're pretty much just trying to get them on there as access points, and worrying more about things like ordering later. So where can you find this? The scripts are at github.com/Ruth Tillman/ASpace A shout out to Dave Mayo for helping me work through some of the documentation, which I did a little differently than normal, and I hope that they're pretty well documented for people to reuse them. If you have any questions and you'd like to do this kind of thing, please get in touch with me at rkt6@psu.edu. And I'm going to try to pull together the cell cross info and also some of the other technical steps I did, either for a blog post and or for a practice article. So stay tuned. This is sort of step 1 of sharing the work, and I'm trying to hold off on really publishing about it until I've done the next 2 batches, but it's been good so far. Great. Thank you. That's my presentation.
Oh, great. Thank you, Ruth. And there are some time limitations for people in this block, so I want to take questions for Ruth now. We've been holding them to the end for some blocks, but this one I think I'd like to be kind to the presenters and take questions as we go. So does anyone have any questions for Ruth and the method that she's worked out here? We've got one in the chat here. So from Laura, so what do you think is the one thing you wish you'd have considered or realized before embarking on the project? What caught you by surprise?
I think what really caught me by surprise was the level of difficulty in matching the MARC records and ArchivesSpace records. I definitely had expected a certain amount of difficulty, but I had not anticipated how much work it would be. So I think the better people can find ways to do that or to make sure that those records are kept up to date, that would be great. And I also will say that this is my sort of streamlined version. The previous version had about 7 steps, so after taking it through a test run, I got it down to the 5 that I spelled out. But wow. I got a little caught up around the creation of subjects and attaching them properly to resources.
Do you see this method extending to agents as well, or other types of records, or subjects is really the focus right now, and you don't need to look further than that?
I think I'd like to try doing it with agents. When I looked at agents, they were a little more complex, and I would like to start adding URIs. At this point, I think I'm going to wait and go back and do everybody at once, because I'd also want to update everybody's URIs, and I actually have a script for doing that too that I can use. But yes, I'd like to extend it to agents. I think the one real difficulty is this one just attaches them at the highest level with a basic, this is a subject relationship. Agents are a little more complex, and that's where I don't want to screw things up.
Does anyone have any other questions for Ruth? All right, well, thank you, Ruth, and you're very welcome to stick around if you like, but you're also excused if you would not like to stick
Might log
around.
off and go to bed.
Good night to you. Take care. Thank you.